Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and it is finally time. It is World Season here in 2025, and we are kicking off our World coverage of the 2025 World Championships with my top 20 players at the World Championships list that I put out every single year that basically everybody is doing around this time. But I'm so excited. This is one of my favorite videos to do all year long because this really is a culmination in a way of a lot of the analysis that we've done over the course of this year. Of course, it's not the primer. We don't get to talk about the teams and their details, but this is me kind of calling my shot on who I think the best players in the world are. Oftentimes, this list ages very, very well. Not to pat myself on the back or anything, but we've gotten pretty darn good results, we'll just say, with this in the past years. We've been doing this since 2022, and I'm excited to see how it goes in 2025. If you guys are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Always curious to know where you agree, where you disagree, who you think is too high, who you think is too low, all of that stuff. This is very much a list that is open to critique and criticism. You know, I wouldn't be posting it on the internet if I just wanted everybody to sit there and say that, you know, my opinion is the same as everybody else's. I'm curious to know, you know, where exactly I'm kind of on par with maybe a lot of other people's opinions and where I'm maybe going out on a limb in terms of my opinions. Always curious to know where you guys land on all of those things down below. But that does bring us to at least a couple of caveats that I want to make sure I get out at the beginning of this video. First, this is basically like a top 25. I know that feels like, you know, wrong. Everybody who does top whatever lists ends up doing it like this where there are honorable mentions. I feel like there kind of have to be honorable mentions for a list like this. So there's 5 players that I want to list, and we'll talk about them that didn't quite make the list, but will make, you know, an impact at Worlds. Are players I very much considered for this top 20, but also a little bit of a caveat in that direction. This was the hardest list I've had to make, or maybe even the easiest, kind of depending on how you want to look at it. It was both the hardest and the easiest that I've had to make, because I think the talent pool was way more inconsistent in 2025. Whether you believe that's because of Fearless or generally because of the way that the meta ended up breaking down is kind of up to you, but there just weren't a lot of players that were just good throughout the year. There were a lot of up and down performances. I think everybody has their own sets of flaws and strengths, and therefore I think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about when it comes to the order and also the placement, because how much do you want to value recent performance versus how much do you want to value how these players have played throughout all of this year and even in previous years. It's a balance that I tried to strike, but I'll talk about each individual, you know, player and circumstance when we get to them. And then the main caveat, obviously, this is just my opinion. You can have your own. I already talked about it. I'm open to criticism. You guys are more than welcome to tell me how stupid my list is in the comment section. It really helps boost engagement. But if you do have a very different opinion, if a player is, you know, 2 or 3 spots different than where I put them, we're probably in a similar position on how we feel about them. But if there's like a 10 or a 20 or like a whole list of a difference between, you know, where I put a player and maybe where you feel like they should be, let me know why you think that down in the comments as well. I'm always curious to know, again, where you guys agree and where the consensus kind of disagrees from maybe what my takes are. So those are the caveats. Those are the main things out of the way. Let's get into the list. We're almost 3 minutes. Actually, we are 3 minutes into this video. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much. Let's get into my honorable mentions, which are going to be thrown up on the screen now. These are 5 players that I considered for the list, but ultimately decided not to put into the top 20, all for various reasons that we will go over now. You can see that list of 5 players is 369, the top laner from Top Esports, Zeka, the mid laner from Hanwha Life, Elk, the AD carry from Bilibili Gaming, Gala, the AD carry from Invictus Gaming, and Kyle, the support from Anyone's Legend. All for, again, various different reasons, some pluses and some minuses, I think, to go along with basically all of their games. For 369, I honestly just don't think he was spectacular enough throughout the summer split. This guy's hyper consistent, and he's very good at playing weak side top. He can carry. We know that he can be aggressive and win, you know, on the top side 1v1 if left in isolated situations, but the way that Top Esports plays is just not there to prop up somebody like 369, to be quite frank. They want to play for bot lane, and specifically they want to play for jungle, and so you're in a spot where 369 is often a very good player, a very productive player, but one that almost blends into the background. I think there were multiple moments throughout this split where he could have played better, at least in summer. That being said, he was still excellent in winter and in spring, and was really good at the beginning of the year, especially in winter when this team won the LPL, and I think I would expect him to be really good at this tournament, and so I wanted to consider him an honorable mention, but really didn't come all that close to actually making the top 20, just more so felt like a player that I wanted to give a shout out here. Zeka is going to be here in the honorable mention section. I believe this is the first time he's been an honorable mention. I think he's been on the list every single year that he's made Worlds since this channel has started, because he certainly was on the list in 2022 when I was super high on him coming out of the LCK. Obviously, that turned out pretty well. He won Worlds and, you know, World Finals MVP and, you know, all of this stuff, ended up becoming this super clutch performer, and then Last year, he was on this list as well when Hanwha Life was the #1 seed. Didn't quite have the same year and honestly really struggled down the stretch. Again, a player that I think was looking, about as expected at the beginning of the year. He had some really good moments in winter and in spring when this team was doing well, very similar to what we talked about with 369 and Top Esports, but things fell apart at the end of the spring split when they got reverse swept by Gen G and then got swept in general by T1. And then from there, Zeka's never really felt like he's gotten back on track. I think it's very much in him to have the best games that he's played in a long time at the World Championships. That's kind of how this guy is built, just in the way that he plays the game, but I certainly need to see it before I put him on the list. So he ends up dropping off. Oh, also, if you see the numbers in parentheses from, like -6 or -17 or anything like that, that is their ranking in reference to what they were on this list last year for Worlds 2024. So 369 was an honorable mention last year. That's why his equal Zeka was on the list, but he was on the list at number 14. So he's technically dropped, or 15, I guess. He's technically dropped 6 spots to go down to the honorable mention. So we'll kind of talk about that as we go throughout the rest of this video. But Elk is the next one to talk about here. He was ridiculously high on my list last year. I think he was number 4 on my list last year in terms of all the players in the world. I had him number 1 in terms of all AD carries on my top 20 players in the world. And honestly, was I wrong? Like, that guy was absolutely the best AD carry at the tournament last year. He was excellent for Billy Gaming, got them over the hump that was Hanwha Life in the quarterfinals, not the semifinals. They had an easy semifinals matchup against Weibo, and then they were one game away from winning the World Championships. Unfortunately, Elk has also not really been able to follow up his breakout 2024, or at least his ascending 2024 with as good of a 2025. He's been a good player, just not a great player. I've been a lot lower on his year. I think he's kind of, again, faded into the background for a Billy team that's really been looking for somebody to carry games consistently. His laning prowess that really pushed him ahead of everybody last year has just not necessarily been there as much. He still is a very lane-dominant 2v2 player. It's just not to the point where he's a top 20 player at this tournament because of it. And then kind of on the flip side of that, Gala is also going to be an honorable mention for me. He's basically the opposite. I think that there have been moments he's been good in lane, but really what Gala does at an exceptional level is win team fights for this team. Now, the concerning part and the reason he's here is because he's the opposite of 369 and Zeka. There were many moments at the beginning of the year where he did not look like he was going to be a player that was even coming close to this list, where Invictus did not feel like a team that was even going to make the World Championships, but Gala really solidified, and he was excellent in terms of this team qualifying as that 4th seed out of the LPL. Without him, I'm not quite sure they make it here as consistently as they do, so I wanted to give him an honorable mention. I think he's also been on the list every single year that I've done this since 2022, so maybe the first year ever that Gala is just an honorable mention. And then finally, Kyle in his first ever Worlds is going to be an honorable mention for me. Support's a weird position to try to grade. There are no LPL supports on this list. No shocker there, I think, for anybody who watched the LPL, but if there were, it would have been Kyle. I do think he's the one I expect the most out of. He hasn't been super consistent. LPL supports in general just aren't very consistent. AL in general has not been very consistent, but I think Kyle has that kind of playmaking upside and general lane 2v2 ability to really crack through on Worlds and take advantage of teams that might not be ready for him. So, I wanted to give some LPL support at least a shout in this video, and instead of I ended up going with Kyle. A little bit of a spoiler for the list there. No LPL supports on the list, but those are my honorable mentions. But that's the preamble out of the way. It's time to actually get into the top 20 list. So here we go. There's nothing else left to preview, nothing else left to talk about. It's time to get into who got number 20, who's going to be kicking off the list. And number 20 for me is going to be Inspired, the jungler for FlyQuest, the #1 seed from the LTA North, and my only Western player on the list. This should be no real surprise to anybody who's been watching the channel. There's only one other Western player who's ever been on a top 20 list, and it's Caps, and he's done it twice. He was number 20, I believe, in 2022, and then number 19 last year, representing G2. Inspired becomes the second Western player to make a top 20 players at Worlds list, but he has more than earned it. And if you guys know the channel, you know I don't just give these out for like free. You know what I mean? I'm not just putting a Western representative somewhere on the top 20 list. Most of the time, they'll get something in an honorable mention or anything like that. If you watch the 2023 list, you'll know I was not close to putting any Western player near the top 20 on that list, but Inspired has more than earned his spot as a top 20 player, probably in the world right now, and at times he's performed even better than this. I just felt like I had to put him on this list, and I do think he's been better than all of the players we mentioned in the honorable mention segment, so he makes the list at number 20. We can kind of go over what you're seeing on the screen very quickly, but it's a pretty easy layout, hopefully, to be able to digest. Of course, Inspired's 3 most played champions are going to be here immediately to his right, the Xin Zhao, the Wukong, and the Sejuani in that order. The All-Pro team, it says K-Man All-Pro team, that's where I personally personally put him on my All-Pro ballots that I submitted and I posted on this channel, covering all of the major regions throughout this year and throughout this split. And then player of the series, this might get some question marks. Like, this is only going to be for the summer split. I could theoretically go back and comb through my winter and my spring rankings as well and do like a player of the series for the entire year count, but I think it's more accurate to talk about the form that these players had been in. And unfortunately for Inspired, that means he only gets one because the LTA split was very strange. They basically played a couple of regular season games and then immediately went into playoffs, and so it just ends up being a bit of a lower number. That will get a little bit better when we actually start talking about the LCK and the LPL players. Spoiler alert, that's everybody except for Inspired throughout the rest of this list, and they obviously played a lot more games. It's going to be a lot more, interesting to see the difference between like 2 and 3 versus the 4 and 5. I think that's kind of the big split here in terms of player of the series, but that's just a little housekeeping. Let's actually talk about Inspired and the year that he had that led up to this. Obviously, this guy is the heart and soul for FlyQuest. He is the reason why this team is looked at as the, in my opinion, best Western team at this tournament. No spoilers for my primer video tomorrow when I do my team power rankings, but I think Fly is just on fire right now, and Inspired has proven that he can keep up, I think, with basically most Eastern players in the jungle. We saw that when he went up against Billy Gaming at MSI, and quite frankly, he was just better than Beichuan at that tournament. Not that Beichuan is like the most dominant player in the universe, but he completely smashed BLG in game number 1 of that series and looked excellent in game number 3, game number 4. Like, he was just really consistent throughout that entire series for FlyQuest. If there was ever a question on whether or not Inspired's great form domestically was going to be able to carry over to the international stage, I think that that was dismissed when he did get to MSI, but he does it in a way that I think is so interesting, because when you think of these super dominant junglers that come out of the West and ones that are able to keep up with a lot of the Eastern players, a lot of them are very good mechanically, but sometimes can struggle from the macro perspective to be able to play the rest of the map. What Inspired has done over the course of this year is go from being this late game team fighting monster who really specialized in champions like Viego and Lilia throughout his career, to playing Sejuani and to playing Maokai and to playing Wukong, a lot of these team fight engagers that can really set up the rest of his team and controlling the map in the mid game because of it. There are very, very few junglers in the world, let alone Western players, that can play the map the way that Inspired does. He is definitely a player who has more than earned his spot here. I think the only question is, should he be higher? Number 20 felt, I think, appropriate for me in terms of how this ended up breaking down. I just think there are a lot of really good players in the world, and it's hard for me to justify that at his floor, like bare minimum, he's definitely going to be a top 15 player at this tournament. I think that there is a world where he struggles against some of the other junglers that are going to be on this list, but he more than earned a spot onto the top 20 and has more than earned his, place as only the second Western player to ever break the list. But then moving on to number 19, and it's so funny to have these two players back to back just because of, the historical representation of these two. But coming in at number 19, it's the GOAT. It's Faker coming in at 19 for me. This is just about as high as I could realistically put Faker on this list. We know that he's going to get a Worlds buff. We know he's going to play better at this tournament than he has throughout this year. But as a reminder, I'm ranking these players based on what they have been throughout 2025, what they've been in the past, and also partially what I'm expecting from them. If it had just been what Faker has been throughout 2025, he's probably not on this list. He's probably a bit lower than someone like Zeka, who might have taken his spot here at number 19 or number 20 on this list. But I just trust that I can't leave Faker out of the top 20 without looking like an idiot here at the World Championships. It's just kind of how it goes. You can see he did not make an All-Pro team for me in the summer split here. I had 3 mid laners that were above him. We will see 2 of those mid laners on this list a little bit later, and then I gave a little bit of a shout to Showmaker for just being the best player in the Rise group. That's just kind of how I broke down. I don't think Faker was ridiculously impressive on T1, so it didn't feel particularly bad for leaving him off the list. But he also didn't get a single player of the series for T1 throughout all of the summer split. I do want to kind of, justify some of these stats, though, because he was really good. He was a very valuable player, I would say, overall for T1. He just wasn't the main character or how they wanted to play the game. He was mostly, fading into the background. That's probably a fair way to put what Faker was for a majority of this year. He was playing things like Orianna and Ryze and Galio, and he was staying neutral in lane or getting a small lane lead and then rotating to help Oner or Keria make a lot of aggressive plays on the map. And that's a very valuable thing. It's just really hard to quantify how important that is in an isolated isolated context. And that's why for me, it's just hard to put him above some of the other players that we are going to see on this list. In terms of production, is this guy going to play like a top, 5 player in the world? Probably. It's just kind of how things go. He probably won't do it during the Swiss stage, but the moment we get into the knockouts, the moment the quarterfinals begin and those best of 5 start rolling, that's when Faker wakes up and plays the best league he always plays all year long. The only concerning thing is that he was a little bit better earlier on in the year. Now, this has kind of become, a Fakerism, if you will, where he plays really well in winter or at the beginning of spring and, looks like the player that came off of a world championship. And then, in summer, something happens. Last year, it was a bit of an injury, a bit of a wrist problem, and he didn't play for a majority of the year. And then, he's had some troubles in the summer split in the past. He was okay and probably better than normal in the summer split, but we've seen this natural regression happen over the course of a year for a player in Faker who just has so many games under his belt, and yet he always seems to figure it out once he gets to Worlds. I still have a firm belief that he's going to be able to do that. Do I think he's going to change his play style? Probably not. I think this meta honestly lends itself more to what Faker's been doing all year long, which is playing Ryze and Galio and Talia and moving around the map, playing Orianna and being able to team fight. We have seen some assassins pop up at ASI, things like LeBlanc that have gotten back into the meta. Of course, Faker going to be very happy if that ends up being something that, kind of turns in his favor. But for now, Faker is a very consistent mid laner who doesn't necessarily have ridiculous highs, and then the World's buff's going to pop in and make this number 19 look ridiculous. Then coming in at number 18 for me is one of the players who fell the most from the previous list, who at the very least remained on the list. It's going to be Ben, the top laner from Billy Gaming at 18. This felt like a weird player to try and place because, again, Ben has had such an up and down 2025. He's been in a spot where there have been times where he's been able to carry the team and where he's really kind of stepped up and dominated a lot of games, but that consistency has just not been there, and we've seen this out of Ben in the past. 2024 was a weird year because he actually put it together for 12 months. Essentially, like the entire year he was good, and that's not very Ben of him. One of the things that he was criticized for early on in his career in the LPL was the fact that his regular seasons would not be all that good. He would be pretty inconsistent in those regular seasons and then turn it on in the playoffs and at international tournaments when he needed to for teams like Suning. And obviously, that wasn't the case last year when he was like a superstar and, a borderline top 5 player in the world, but we got much more of the Ben that we were used to before that year here in 2025, where, man, I just need to see that consistency go back up. He's losing lane a lot more than he ever did last year, and I think that is the most concerning trait when it comes to Ben, is that he's so mechanically talented, and we know he can take over in the late game team fights. I continue to believe that there is no better team fight top laner in the history of League of Legends than Ben. There is nobody who finds those angles. There's nobody who can take over 5v5s nearly as much as Ben has been capable of doing from that position, but he's had a lot harder of a time actually getting there, and we've even seen some flaws in terms of the way he's executed. But all of that being said, he's still Ben. Like, even a weakened version of Ben is going to have, a couple of games, probably 70% of his games be better than almost any other top laner in the world. His mechanical skill is still ridiculous in terms of how easy it is for him to push leads once he is able to generate them. And he's not afraid of picking aggressive picks. We see the Renekton being his most played over the course of this year. That's not of this split at the very least. That's not entirely surprising if you know Ben, but it's certainly not common right now amongst top laners. Things like Mbessa and Ornn also in that list. No Sion. And I think that's the main thing for Ben, is he wants to get himself involved with the rest of the team. Where is Billy going to stand at this tournament? I think that's going to determine how high Ben can actually go in terms of these rankings, how much value you actually want to put into him as a player. But I do want to say, I don't think Ben is the player that he was in 2024. I don't think he's in the running for being the best top laner in the world like I think he ran away with in 2024. I think he's deserved a spot on this list because he was very good in the playoffs and helped Billy get another LPL title. But there are some question marks about whether or not Ben can actually go toe-to-toe with the best top laners in the world right now. But then moving on to number 17, and it's another player who fell quite a bit from last year, and quite frankly, this might be his lowest placement on this list since I started doing it. It's Peanut, the jungler for Hanwha Life Esports, coming in at number 17 for me. You guys know I'm a huge fan of Peanut, and honestly, if there was ever a year for me to be biased and put him higher than he performed throughout a lot of the year, it's probably this year, because as far as we know, this is going to be the last time that Peanut plays at the World Championships. It does seem like he's going to take his mandatory military service at the end of this year, and that, he probably isn't coming back from that, and so this is very likely the last, Peanut Worlds appearance ever. I would love to sit here and put him top 10 like he's been kind of unanimously over the past, 3 or 4 years, but I just don't necessarily feel like the year he's played up until this point has justified that kind of placement. He's been a good, certainly not a consistent player, and again, you're going to hear that phrase a lot as we talk about this list. You've already heard it a lot from the players we've kind of brought up until this point, but really, I think Fearless has introduced a lot of inconsistency to these players, where one series they can be great, another they can be quite poor. The thing about Peanut is it always seems like he figures it out when he needs to, especially domestically, to be able to get into good situations. This guy was just in the finals. He won winners finals to get himself there. This was a team that was a potential favorite to go to Worlds as the #1 seed from the LCK, and just because they weren't able to handle Gen G in that series doesn't mean that Peanut is at fault. I think the big thing for Peanut is that he needs to stop fading into the background as much for this team. I love him as an engage threat, and I do think he's always been at his best when he plays these tankier engage junglers. Things like Jarvan, things like, Maokai and Sejuani have always been kind of the main things for Peanut. He's been the best, tank jungle player in the world, facilitative jungle player in the world, as I've always talked about. But the problem right now is that when he does pull out the more aggressive picks, even things like, I already mentioned the Jarvan, but if you want to play the Jarvan as more of a skirmisher, or things like Xin Zhao and Wukong that we see on this list, you need to be more active in the mid game, and I'm not exactly sure that he's in that mindset right now. It really feels like him and Zeka are kind of off base in terms of how they want to play the game, and I think that's hurt his individual performance, and just kind of goes back to the beginning of the year where he genuinely just was not good until he figured things out in the playoffs, in the winter split, in the LCK Cup to get himself to first stand. There have been a lot of ups and downs for Peanut over the course of 2025, but this could be the biggest up of them all. He set himself up into at least a pretty good spot to compete for a world championship this year, and he's certainly going to be one of the easiest players to root for at the entire tournament. Do I think he's in the best form of his entire career? No, I don't. I would actually argue that of his time since returning to the LCK, since he came back, and honestly, even going back before that, this might be one of the weaker years of his entire career in terms of his individual production, even talking about the LGD and, T1 days, Rocks Tigers, obviously before that. Like, I think you can look at 2025 as one of the weakest years of Peanut's career, but if that's the version of Peanut that we're getting and he's still a top 20 player in the world, imagine if he can click for one tournament. Imagine if that facilitative style steps up and you can get players like Zeka and Viper on your team, Zeus on the top side fed. That version of Peanut has more than enough tools to be able to carry his team to a world championship. It's really just about, can he do it in his last and final moments as a professional player? The story is definitely on the spotlight, the camera, all of it is going to be on Peanut throughout this entire tournament, and I, for one, hope he really outperforms this number 17 ranking. Then moving on to number 16, which I think is going to be one of my more controversial picks on this list. I'm curious to see how people end up responding to this. It's going to be Duro, the support for Gen G, coming in at number 16. I think there are going to be people that leave him off this list entirely because he's a rookie and he gets to play with a bunch of veterans, and that how good can Duro actually be? He gets to play with 4, of the best of all time, yada, 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 all that stuff. I think anybody who actually watched Gen G over the course of this year knows that Duro deserves a spot on this list, and even from his raw performance in 2025, maybe deserves to be higher on this list than number 16, but for a player going to his first ever world championship, it feels kind of right to keep him down here around number 16. I feel like this is kind of a good balancing spot for a player like Duro, where there are more experienced players above him, but maybe players that have had similar, if not slightly worse years to him so far. Duro being the lowest rated Gen G player on this list should tell you a lot, because that team is just in ridiculous form right now, but look at what they've trusted him to play. This guy's playing Rakan and Nico and Rel every single game. He's not playing these Nautilus, Leona, lanes and just kind of being told, or even like the Lulu and the Milio and things like that, and being told to just play for the team. He's being given a lot of keys as a playmaker for this team to set things up. He's been a really good laner, and he's been an excellent mid-game player to open things up for Gen G. If you haven't seen this guy, if you're not an LCK fan, if you're not somebody who's been, locked in and watching him play all this year, there have been real times that he has been a top 2 or a top 3 player on the team and really been pushing them forward towards their inevitable championship in the LCK. He was a second team All-Pro for me in the support position. That's only because the first place guy was just so ridiculously good, but I think Duro has been as good as any other support in the world so far in 2025. If that's the kind of form that we're getting from a first-time Worlds player, especially surrounded by a core that should be able to guide him pretty easily on the international stage, that is massive. This kid was also very good at MSI, and I think that is also something worth noting, but there is the real possibility that he's just not what he was in the LCK on the international stage, that potentially going into more consistent drafts and more consistent comps and playing more best of 5s as we get later and later into this tournament does expose some of his flaws a bit more. There are some times where he's a bit out of position in the late game in particular. His early and mid games I think are incredibly solid. It's clear that Gen G have worked very hard on that, but sometimes he can be a little bit apprehensive, we'll just say, to make a gigantic play at the end of the game. If he can get some nerves out from under him and not worry too much about the situation, understand that he's good enough to be performing at this level and that the team clearly trusts him to perform at this level, I think he's going to be just fine, and I think he could make for one of the biggest first-time Worlds players at this entire tournament. Then moving on now to number 15, and this is where I think there is a bit of a, I don't want to say a jump or a gap or anything like that, but I do think that, number 15 is going to surprise some people with how low he is on the list. It's JackeyLove, the AD carry for top esports, and I think a lot of people are going to have him closer to top 10 than maybe I will. He's actually dropping quite a few spots from last year, despite a lot of people saying and kind of being off the belief that he was way better this year. I think he was better this year than he was last year, but I thought he was really good last year, and I think that it's close. My big problem with JackeyLove is I'm just not quite so sure that he's in good form right now. He was excellent in the regular season, and I thought he was super consistent throughout a majority of the year, like even going back to, winter and spring. I think that there were a ton of moments where JackeyLove felt like one of the best players in the world, but his playstyle doesn't necessarily lend itself to me considering him like elite. I think especially once we saw what happened in the playoffs with him just not being good enough against Billy Gaming, and obviously him needing to go through the regional qualifiers because Top Esports didn't have the championship points. It kind of reminded me like, okay, this guy does have some flaws, and honestly, when you compare him to the other AD carries that are above him, spoiler alert, it's just LCK AD carries above him, I just don't necessarily think he's on that same kind of playing field. I think the LPL in general has really suffered in terms of reputation over the past couple of months, and I think JackeyLove is taking a bit of a hit for that in terms of his ranking, but he still is a very accomplished player, and again, JackeyLove, very similar to what we talked about with Peanut, a very easy player to root for at this tournament because it could be his last world championship ever. I don't really know what's going to happen with JackeyLove. He's been very vague about, what his plans are for next year on stream, and just, in terms of interviews. We know he's going through a lot of hearing problems right now, and he wants to get that settled in the offseason, but if this is one of his last worlds, I think he's in great form to actually make the most of it, unlike someone like Peanut that we talked about a bit earlier. He was a first-team All-Pro AD carry in the LPL. He really was carrying and kind of elevating top esports for a long time. I just worry, again, about whether or not he's going to be able to go up against the best AD carries that the LCK has to offer and be able to go toe-to-toe with them. For now, that is good enough for a top 15 spot, but I think I might actually be a little bit lower on JackeyLove than the consensus right now. Then moving on now to number 14 on this list, and this is a player that I think is a little bit difficult to talk about because, again, kind of similar to the players we've talked about so far, he's had good moments, he's had bad moments, and the consistency just hasn't been there. But he's a big game performer, and I believe he's going to do well here. It's Zeus, the top laner for Hanwha Life, coming in at number 14 for me. Throughout the beginning of this year, when you're talking about winter and about spring, and especially before we ended up getting the qualification for MSI from the LCK, just kind of coming out of the regular season, I would have said that Zeus was the best top laner in the world, and I would have felt pretty confident in saying that. I think for most of this year, he was the best top laner in the world. But again, Hanwha Life had a very weird end of the year where things kind of go off the rails in their series against Gen G to qualify for MSI. They end up getting blown out by T1, and they never really recover that momentum until it comes down to the summer split playoffs where, they end up getting back on track. Viper, Zeka, Delight, even Zeus to an extent, they all play incredibly well and start to dominate a lot of these games. Do I take that version of Zeus and just say that that's going to be what he is? Zeus was really only bad, I would say, for like the regular season of summer. Every other part of this year, he was really good. And even then, he wasn't bad in the regular season of summer. He was just inconsistent. He was kind of the Zeus we had all become accustomed to. But the reason he kind of gets the nod over someone like JackeyLove from Top Esports, who had that number 15 spot, is I just believe in his performance at the World Championships a little bit more. I think he has a lot to prove going over here to HLE, of course, a two-time world champion now from his time on T1. And I think he's not afraid to play a lot of these carries. We saw from him, things like Mbessa and Aatrox a lot more, especially Aatrox, than any other player that's going to be near this list in the world. Rumble, Mbessa, basically everybody is playing those champs, but Zeus is here to take over in the early game and to try to scale that out of control. He wants to play champions that can have control in the early 1v1 and can also do things in the later part of the game. And if he is able to accomplish that, yes, he's going to be one of the most effective players at this tournament. I think especially he kind of gets the bump to number 14, maybe as opposed to being 15 or 16 on this list because top lane is worse, I think, than a role like AD carry. I think it's going to be easier for him to take over in a lot of these games against, lesser competition at this tournament than it might be for someone like JackeyLove on Top Esports to do the same, where AD carry is much deeper as a role. So for Zeus, it's kind of maybe a back and forth pick, something I've certainly kind of considered. Do I really want to go for it? Do I really want to give him that nod, that edge, considering the fact that he wasn't perfect throughout summer, but, especially thinking back to just how good he was, like in that MVP race alongside Chovy for a majority of the year. And, the fact that this is a guy who consistently steps up in big moments and has had some phenomenal Worlds performances, it does kind of give him the edge a little bit and puts him to number 14 in my rankings. Then moving on to number 13, and it's actually going to be back-to-back teammates here from 14 to 13. Coming in at 13 for me, it is going to be Delight, the support for Hanwha Life, coming in one spot, again, above his teammate in Zeus. I think, you know, Delight has had a weird year, kind of in the same vein as someone like Zeus, you know, kind of following that Hanwha Life trajectory, but I think for him, it's not been nearly as bad as a lot of people have made it out to be. I think this guy has generally just been good across all of 2025, and quite frankly, he's been better this year than he was at times last year, and I don't know if he's necessarily getting the credit for that. I think 13 is a more than fair position for someone like Delight on this list, and I think he does a lot of the heavy lifting for a team like Hanwha Life, and I expect him to continue to perform like that. One of the big things that I've always given Delight a lot of credit for, because I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of his when he was on Bro. It's not like, you know, Duro, who was already on this list, a player he gets compared to a lot, where Gen G, you know, pluck him out of a bottom team, you know, start him on a super team, and he ends up turning into one of the better supports in the world. It's not like that, where Duro showed all of those signs, in my opinion, on Fear X last year. He was a phenomenal prospect that I think every top team should have been looking at. Delight kind of came out of nowhere, at least for me, in terms of seeing him get that Gen G opportunity. But the thing about Delight that has been so impressive is that every single year, and really every single time I see this guy play, every game he plays, he gets better. He just continues to improve. He just continues to get more consistent as he plays a little bit more. He started off as a good player with some inconsistencies that did not have a lot of responsibility on that Gen G team. He goes over to Hanwha Life, and in year one on that HLE team takes even a step up. I said he played better last year than he did on Gen G, and I continue to stand by that. I thought he was really good for that HLE team, made this top 20 list last year at number 17, but I think he's been even better this year. I think especially when you look at the beginning of the year, that guy was the best support in the world for most of this year, and obviously he has very much been overtaken. There have been some unbelievable support performances down the stretch that we will talk about from some other players on this list, but I can't really wrap my mind around why Delight is coming in so low on so many of these lists, why he's not being considered top 15 bare minimum. I think you could even go a bit higher than number 13 if you really wanted to. He's playing things like Alistair and Rel, you know, these tanky engagers, but I think specifically it's the Braum that really stood out to me. The lane dominance that him and Viper can have when they are on form together is ridiculously good, and I think Delight at times has just been the best player for Hanwha Life, so I feel more than comfortable giving him a spot on this list. The question is now, is he going to have this kind of performance at Worlds? Well, I'm clearly putting a lot of eggs in the Hanwha Life basket. No spoilers there, I think, in terms of just, you know, where things are at. I think there are 3 teams that are very heavily represented on this list, and they're the 3 teams that I think a lot of people are considering favorites at this tournament, but Delight has more than earned his spot, I think, in the top 15 and potentially like around the top 10, and who knows, with the kind of progression this guy is on, he might even be in the top 10 and continue to rise going into next year. I'm just a really big fan of his game. I think he's really strong macro-wise. I think he plays laning phase really well. I think he has good synergy with Viper in the bot lane, and I think he's going to be a player that you have to watch out for every single time Hanwha Life plays at Worlds. Then moving on to number 12 in these rankings, and this is a player that for most of this year would have been in the top 5, and he might have even made a case to be like near top 3 or top 4, but man, that consistency has really just become a problem, and I get it. A lot of responsibility for him, but coming in at number 12, it's going to be Tarzan, the jungler for anyone's legend. You know, I'll get it out of the way. You know, I know there might be a lot of people tuning into this video that don't normally watch the channel. Of course, I cover all 4 of the major regions every single game, but I'm pretty vocal on the channel about how Tarzan's my favorite player in the world. I've always been pretty biased towards Tarzan in terms of wanting him to succeed and wanting to, you know, have him be very good. And at the beginning of this year, he made me look like an absolute genius for continuing to believe in him. Not that he hasn't already throughout basically every year of his career. He goes to the finals with LNG in the LPL in 2023. He makes the semifinals of Worlds, basically dragging that Weibo Gaming team last year, and then this year Anyone's Legend kind of comes out of nowhere, basically only upgrades in top and jungle, and Tarzan becomes one of the most successful players in the world. The problem is that inconsistency is carried over throughout all of this year. For all of the player of the series that he's gotten, 3 of them, one of the higher on this list in terms of the amount of player of the series that he's gotten just as many dud of the series because he is Anyone's Legend. I cannot stress that enough. We'll talk about this more in the primer, but I'm not sure there's a single player at this tournament who has more responsibility for his team's success than Tarzan does for Anyone's Legend. If that team is going to play well, Tarzan has to beat and gap the opposition on the other side, and if he can't do that, they're not going to win games, and it makes it difficult for him to shine individually as much as maybe you would want because he has to take a lot of these risks. He can't play that safer, more facilitative style that I think made him probably one of the most consistent junglers in the world. He was very much built in the Peanut mold of how he wanted to play the game. Unfortunately, he's had to pick up things like, Trundle and Jarvan a lot more consistently and try to play a lot more for the skirmish-heavy game, because if he's not generating those resources, this team is kind of cooked. But at the same time, that's got to be in his favor, right? Anyone's Legend won the LPL in the spring split. They did really well at MSI in terms of their actual performance, taking T1 to 5 games and really being a big nuisance for them. And he was arguably the best winning jungler in the LPL throughout all of the entire summer split. It's just the problem is those losing games, and they get a little bit frustrating to try and watch. I still love Tarzan. Obviously, it's coming from me. I have to praise this guy at least a little bit for the gameplay he has, but he's the only Anyone's Legend member that's going to be making the top 20. He's more than earned a spot on this list. Again, if you had taken this poll, taken this list at the beginning of, at the beginning of summer, really even just after MSI, Tarzan is probably top 5 on this list. That's where he was at. He's probably the number 1 jungler on this list and number 1 in the world. Unfortunately, things have not necessarily looked the same for him throughout a lot of the rest of the year. Hopefully he can get that form back, because I really think he's AL's best shot to do anything at this tournament. That's going to bring us to number 11 on my list, and unfortunately, the last player that is technically outside the top 10. I feel really bad because this is a player that I think has stepped up their game a lot over the back end of the year, that I trust a lot going into this tournament, but unfortunately, coming just outside the top 10 for me, it will be Gumayusi, the AD carry for T1. He's moving up 5 spots from last year. I think this is the highest he's ever been on this top 20 players at Worlds video, and it's weird. Him moving up 5 spots from last year when he was hard carrying this team throughout basically all of summer split just shows you that there really is a difference in terms of, I think, how good I feel about a lot of players, and I think specifically about the LPL at this tournament, where last year I just had so many players like, oh, I think this player's had an awesome year and has been super consistent, and I think they can carry, and they're in great form, and all of this stuff, that Gumayusi, even with his awesome summer split, only came in at number 16. Well, here you go. Like, he carried again, and I would say maybe not quite as dominantly as he did in summer of last year, but certainly was still one of the primary factors towards why T1 was successful throughout all of summer split, and he's moved up to number 11, and I think Guma has more than earned a spot, like, around, if not in the top 10, and if you wanted to make an argument that he should be top 10, I think that's kind of up to you. We'll talk about more T1 players as we continue to go along on this list, but Guma is just the pinnacle of consistency now, and it's really important to point out that he was not good when he got reinserted into the lineup. Of course, there was all this drama at the start of the year with Smash and with Gumayusi switching in and out, and, Smash playing a lot of games and starting for T1, and then, of course, ownership stepping in and basically saying, we don't care, we need you to play Gumayusi, you're not going to play Smash. Guma came back in and wasn't very good for a pretty large stretch of time, and they were kind of winning, in spite of him, and in the regular season in spring, at least for a majority of that, they weren't necessarily winning in spite of him. They were just kind of an okay team, and they couldn't really seem to figure things out. Oner was carrying a lot of games, but, the bot lane wasn't very good, and then something happened, like, at the same time that Hanwha Life turned off, where they go up against Gen G in their qualification for MSI and get reverse swept and just lose all their confidence, lose all their mental. Basically all of that carried over to T1, who sweep Hanwha Life. They get super on board, beating KT Rolster in that regional qualifier run, that MSI qualification run, and then never really look back. They've pretty consistently been one of the best teams in the world since then, and Guma has been back in form. I think you could make an argument that he has been their most consistent carry throughout all of the second half of this year, and he's really been a big piece. He's been playing things like Sivir and like Xayah that can have a lot of self-peel tools, so we can allow players like Keria or Oner to spend a lot more time, facilitating the game rather than protecting him as an AD carry, but he can still pump out ridiculous amounts of damage in all of these team fights. I've gotten really high on Gumayusi. I think he's really ascended into being one of the most consistent carries in the world. Obviously, do I think that there are some players that just maybe have worse situations that maybe don't get set up nearly as much as Gumayusi? Yeah, that's why he comes in just outside the top 10, but I think 11th is more than fair for a player that, quite frankly, wasn't very good and was benched for parts of this year, rightfully or not. Like, I wouldn't say benched, just being swapped in and out of for parts of this year. I think 11th is kind of a fair place to put it, and especially for this being the highest placement he's ever had on one of these top 20 lists, I think this is a nice landing spot for Guma. But then now moving on to our top 10. This is really the big one. Top 20 is obviously an accomplishment, but getting inside the top 10 really proves you are undoubtedly one of the best players in the world. And coincidentally, kicking off our top 10 at number 10 is a player who had the exact same spot last year. It's Kiin, the top laner from Gen G, getting this number 10 spot. And some people might see this as a bit low. He's the best top laner in the world after all. And you know what? I agree. I do think that he is the best top laner in the world. Unfortunately, there is is no top laner that I have in the top 9 in this list. I hope you guys can understand the top lane is just one of those positions right now in the meta that doesn't really feel like anybody's taking over in that role. Zeus, I think, was the closest to getting there throughout a majority of the year. Kiin, I think, has had some really great performances, especially down the stretch. I think he's played some of the best League he's played all year long in the summer split, which is a great time for that to happen. But I just don't know if right now there's a top laner that feels like a borderline top 7 or 8 player in the world. And so Kiin, for me, comes in at number 10. But that should take nothing away from what is pretty clearly the best top laner in the world going into this tournament. And for a player who has just been so consistent over the course of his entire career, he is very, very quickly, I guess not even quickly, he has very much become one of the best top laners of all time. Like, in the history of League of Legends, Kiin is very high, I think, on that list now. But let's go ahead and talk about what he's been so far this year. Of course, a first-team All-Pro pick for me in the LCK. Got 2 Player of the Series here for Gen G, which is kind of an accomplishment. Like, it's weird to say, like, oh, 2 is like a pretty good number for Player of the Series. You'll see, like, the top end of this list kind of maxes out at like 4 or 5. That's really like the elite number. So 2, pretty good. That means you were very effective, but even more so for the fact that he shares a team with Canyon, Chovy, Ruler, and Duro, who were all just stealing away Player of the Series so many times. Even if Kiin was playing really well, it was hard for him to stand out and be the best player on the Rift, enough so to earn a Player of the Series, but he did so quite a few times over the course of the summer split. And again, I think he faded into the background for a majority of the year, but when he did need to show up, he almost always performed, and he is a big game performer. He's somebody who I trust a lot. This is a player who I think is going to do really well at this tournament. I'm not necessarily worried about Kiin at all. He has been leaning more towards tanks throughout this year, but you can see Gwen is his most played. You know, Gwen's certainly not in the state that she had been for a majority of the year, but it does showcase that Gen G is willing to try and play for some team fights with him later on in the game. He's not just going to pick Sion and, you know, Ornn and basically AFK topside every time so that they can win through everybody else. They can do that. They're certainly effective at being able to do that, but Kiin has so much more to offer than that. He's the complete package. He's a great laner. He's a great team fighter. He's got a great mental. He can lane swap himself into a bad situation and go neutral. He can, you know, win 1v1 if he has to. Like, he's just really good at every part of the game. The super all-arounder on the top side of the map, and one player that has more than earned a back-to-back spot here in the top 10. Then moving on to number 9 in these rankings, and it's a player that is once again moving up despite not even making an all-pro team for me in the summer split. It's Viper, the AD carry for Hanwha Life, coming in at number 9. He's just been so consistent throughout all of this year with the ups, the downs, everything that HLE has suffered. Viper has basically always been a consistently good piece for this team. Now, Viper is not the most consistent AD carry in the world. Like, he is going to have some bad games every once in a while, but in the grand scheme of things, you can excuse the fact that he's had an equal amount of bad games over the course of every split for the fact that every split he's generally just been really good for HLE. Ironically enough, he didn't get an all-pro nod for me in the summer split because, again, just because I wanted to give Diablo a bit of a shout out for how important and how, you know, relevant he was for Fearax. I didn't separate like a Legend group and a Rise group, like all-pro team, so Viper was the one who ended up suffering, but, you know, certainly don't take that away from how good Viper was as an AD carry. He was exceptional. I think the bigger argument here is Gumayusi at 11 and Viper at 9, considering I put Guma as second team All-Pro and Viper was not one of those All-Pros. I do think Gumayusi was better than a player like Viper in the summer split in particular, but Viper has been so much better for basically every part of the rest of this year, and it was pretty close in the summer split. I'm going to give a little bit of the edge right now to Viper in terms of what I'm expecting. I also think he fills a bit of a bigger role on the team that he plays for, so he gets a little bit of a nod. He's obviously just good at everything. Viper is a former world champion. You don't need me to describe to you like what he can do. The only real concern with him is that those bad games that he can have, they can happen at any time. And while it's not necessarily been, you know, historic that he's gone to Worlds and had bad games and not performed well, it's one of those things where you're basically always just hoping that you're not rolling the 1 out of 10 games that Viper has where he's just not performing up to his own standards. He was really good at Worlds last year, but unfortunately was outdueled by a player in Elk who was on fire. And obviously Elk is a very good player, but that was a series that Viper had enough talent and enough, you know, ability to win. He had enough resources to be able to win it, and he just wasn't necessarily there. Do I think he's significantly better going into 2025? No, I would honestly say he's probably the exact same player he was last year, and if that's the case, we do need to see a better output. I'm not trying to sit here and say that Viper underperformed or that he was the problem or anything like that, but the thing that's always been keeping him out of the top 5 has been consistency on a game-to-game basis. It does really feel like he's the main character of Hanwha Hanwha Life right now. They've stopped playing more so for top side and started playing significantly more for bot side throughout a lot of the end of the regular season, and it really helped them when you look at their playoff record, and the fact that they were able to go to finals. They beat T1 in the playoffs and, were able to look really good outside of that finals performance. Viper being so dominant was one of the biggest reasons why this team had no problems in the playoffs. He is one of this team's best players, and this is one of the best teams in the world. You can expect Viper to be at or near the end of this tournament dominating games, and that's what a top 10 player, and I believe a first-time top 10 player, ends up kind of producing for him here. Then moving on to number 8 on this list. And number 8 is so interesting to talk about because he's making a return to this list after not being on it last year, despite being a defending world champion. It's Oner coming in at number 8, the jungler for T1. This was Oner's year. You can talk about a lot of things for T1. You can talk about the fact that they were more consistent throughout a lot of this year, that they genuinely played like a team that looked like a world's favorite, which they don't normally do throughout a majority of the year before turning it on for worlds. If you want to, talk about the biggest thing that ended up changing for this team, it was Oner, in my opinion, having the best year of his entire career. He's been really good for a long time, but it always has felt like he's kind of, I don't want to say plateaued in terms of where he's been at, but he's really had the luck to benefit from the fact that he's been on a team with Zeus and Faker and Guma and Keria, who are always winning individually. Like, his early games have just never needed to be all that good. Really, his role, especially in the regular season domestically for T1, over the entire career that he's been here on T1 has been, okay, play slow, play safe, play for mid-game objectives, and allow your laners to set up their own success, and then assist them where you need to assist them. He's been very good in that role, but it's not necessarily been a world-class type of playstyle from Oner. All of that changed going into 2025. He was given significantly more responsibility. Zeus is out, Doran is in, a much worse laner, but still a very good team fighter that you can play around, and then Faker's laning ended up getting a lot worse this year. Bot lane was kind of a mixed bag throughout a majority of this year. You needed Oner to step up. He needed to be the guy that T1 could rely on while they were figuring things out, getting this roster back together. And he did more than that. He had, the best year of his entire career. I think he was exceptionally good throughout a majority of the year. Now, worth noting, he wasn't as good at the end of the summer split. And I think that that's fair. I think it's fair to call out, like, hey, if this guy was a little bit better in the playoffs, maybe T1 is not coming into this tournament as the 4 seed. If this guy was a little bit better in the regular season, maybe they do actually have the 2 seed going into the playoffs and get side select for that series against Hanwha Life. And, all of this yada yada jargon, right? Like, there are real criticisms of Oner, and obviously he's not the most consistent player in the world either. He's going to be aggressive as a skirmisher in the early game, and he relies a lot on his mechanics, but his mechanics are world class, and I think he's really taken that next leap in terms of the macro, and now he ends up playing the map this year. So for a player who's a multiple-time world champion at this point, somebody who has shown that he can perform at the highest level, for him to finally, maybe not finally get on the list, he's been on the list before, but for him to finally crack the top 10 for the first time in his entire career, because I do think he's playing the best he ever has, it's just a really cool thing to see for a player that I think has made all of the right strides. Then moving on to number 7, and we finally get a chance to go back to the LPL. There's not been a lot of LPL players on this list. It's been very LCK dominated. That will only get worse after this one, but coming in at number 7 for me, it's Kanavi, the jungler for Top Esports. This might be a bit of a controversial pick, especially because JackeyLove is all the way down at number 15, and you've got players like Tarzan at number 12. For Kanavi to be one of 2 LPL players, spoiler alert, in the top 10, it might surprise a lot of people who have not maybe been watching the LPL, or maybe just have a bit of a different opinion of the LPL right now than I do. But honestly, all I've done watching the LPL this year is just go, why is everybody not in on this guy? I get it. Top Esports underperformed in the spring split playoffs. They were not necessarily the team they were in the regular season, but this is a team that has been captained and led by Kanavi throughout all of this year. They won the winter split. They were the first seed in the regular season in spring and just didn't make it happen in the playoffs. They were the first seed in the regular season again in summer. They make finals and lose in the finals. They immediately qualify through regional qualifiers, and Kanavi was an MVP frontrunner in both of those splits. He won MVP in the spring split, and for me, he was second in MVP voting in the summer split. All this guy has done has been really really, really good throughout this year. And I get it. I've always been a very big Kanavi believer on this channel. You can go back and, look at the records at the beginning of this year. I don't endorse, esports gambling. It's not something that I personally want to bring up on this channel a lot, but I did say at the beginning of the year, one of the best, under the radar things no one is talking about is Kanavi for MVP in the LPL, and that came to fruition. This is a guy whose playstyle I really believe in. I believe in the way that he captains top esports, and I think he deserves a spot right around top 5 in the world. I think he is that good, and he's finally gotten a chance to prove it after what was a very weird year last year on JDG. If you want kind of the rundown, if maybe you're not quite as familiar with why Kanavi has been popping off so much, here's the greatest early game jungler of all time. I don't think anybody can even really dispute it at this point. You can talk about how Kanavi is not the most, consistent player in the world, and he certainly isn't the most versatile in terms of his playstyles, but there is no jungler in the history of League of Legends that is so adept at being able to generate early resources like Kanavi is capable of doing. He's always been really good at it, but at this point, what do you even want me to say? This guy is constantly up in gold, he's constantly up in map tempo, and it allows him to do things on the map that other junglers just don't have the option of doing. Yes, would I like to see him more consistent as a late game team fighter? Of course I would. He would be number 1 on this list if he was more consistent as a late game team fighter, but the fact that he's so good at getting leads for players like JackeyLove and, Cream and 369 that can do things with it makes him such a dangerous threat, and he himself is a very good mid-game skirmisher as well. And we've even seen now that, a lot of these more carry junglers are coming into meta. Things like Kiana, things like Zed that are becoming more popular. Not that I think we're going to see a ton of them at Worlds, but Kanavi has showcased that if you can get him on these champions that can carry, I mean, his Kiana was more dangerous than basically anybody else's in the LPL. He could absolutely dominate games in the late game on that champion if you were to give him a good setup. So I'm a full believer in Kanavi. I'm really not buying into any of the Kanavi hate that's going on. He was, again, second in MVP voting for me in the LPL, 4 player of the series for top esports, and was excellent in their playoff run. Has been great all year long. I honestly think anybody putting him outside of the top 8 just hasn't really watched Kanavi throughout this year, because for me, everything on tape would suggest that this is one of the best players in the world. But then moving on to number 6, we are going to stay within the same role and talk about the player that I think just eclipses Kanavi right now for being the best jungler in the world. That is Canyon. Unfortunately, coming just outside the top 5 for me. People might be even more frustrated that Canyon's not in the top 5 than that, Canyon and Kanavi are only 1 spot away from each other. But let me explain, let me kind of go into my thought process before everybody jumps to, calling me a moron for, not putting Canyon in the top 5 after putting him at number 3 on my list last year. First and foremost, I think the big thing here is just that I don't think he's all that integral to what Gen G's game plan actually is. While I do think he is important, do not get me wrong, he's not here at top 6 because I think he's useless or anything like that, and he's the number 1 jungler in the world right now. I'm not trying to sit here and pretend that Canyon's not great or excellent at what he does. His playstyle has to be changed so much in order to fit within the confines of Gen G, and while he is good at that, it just doesn't necessarily turn him into a superstar in terms of the production. And the real big problem for Canyon is just the inherent inconsistency that comes with a player that is as aggressive as he is. If we talk about a player in Kanavi who's very one-dimensional in the way that he plays the game, very early game focused, somebody who wants to generate leads and then try to snowball games out of control, Canyon is the kind of player that needs resources. For Kanavi, you just need to get them somewhere. For Canyon, they've kind of got to be on him in order for him to play at his absolute best. Now, is he a good player on tanks, on other things? Yeah, he's passable, and he's gotten better on things like Maokai, Sejuani, even things like Jarvan that are more facilitative, in terms of how they want to play the map. But this guy really is a teamfight initiator. He is an aggressive playmaker, and he's going to play a lot more similarly to a support than he will to a jungler in the later part of the game, in the way that he is constantly looking to be the first to dive into the action. Now, again, that's not always a bad thing, because you get to play with Kiin and Chovy and Ruler and Duro, who can kind of follow up on a lot of those engages very efficiently. It's just one of those situations where I think that there are going to be times where Canyon's plays are not always optimal, and when you're looking at the best players in the world, unfortunately, that is slightly enough to disqualify him from being a top 5 player. He is arguably still top 3 in terms of mechanics in the world and the way he can execute on these fights. I just think some of the macro decisions end up making him a little bit more susceptible to counterplay than maybe other top tier players. I don't want to walk away from this feeling all that negative. Gen G has been an absolute titan for the last 2 years, and Canyon is a massive part as to why. He has made his case for being the greatest jungler of all time throughout the past couple of years with the performances that he's had. He was already in that conversation conversation before he ever joined Gen G, but now he's been a part of 2 major super teams, and he has a pretty good shot to, at the very least, compete for another world championship over the course of this year. This guy knows how to win in big moments. He is a big game performer, and he's been really good throughout this year. I just think that there are times where he's a bit overshadowed by some of his teammates, and also I think that there are some macro plays that he could clean up, but those are minor mistakes that, you know, worse players don't have the opportunity to say, that's the problem I need to fix. His mechanics are just so good that he puts himself at a level where we have to criticize him just a tad bit more than maybe other players, and there are things to find there when you look a little bit deeper, but overall, like, the base of Canyon's game is still ridiculously strong. But that's going to bring us to our top 5, and if we thought the jump to top 10 was going to either make some people very happy or make some people upset, certainly whoever makes or doesn't make the top 5 is going to make people happy or upset. You can probably guess who those players are at this point with how the rest of the top 10 is broken down, but maybe you're worried that some of them have been left off the list. With how things are on this list, quite frankly, I can kind of understand why you would be worried about that, because everybody's basically inconsistent this year. There's not really a ton of difference between really great players and players that were very good, at least nearly as much as there have been in previous years. But with the preamble out of the way, let's get into the top 5. Coming in at number 5 for me, the first player from his team on this entire list, and the only one, Bdd, the mid laner for KT Rolster, is going to get 5th on my top 20 players at Worlds list. I don't know if this is just too much for a player like Bdd. Like, I get it, he's a really great player and he's a carry, but he's on a bad team. Like, how can I really put him top 5? Well, anybody who has watched this guy over the course of this year, I think, has realized that on any other team and basically any other circumstance, this guy is like fighting for being the best player in the world with the kind of production that he's putting out right now. He just so happens to be on a team in KT Rolster that does not want to give him that level of support basically anywhere else. I think Bdd has earned being in the top 5 on this list, and this is coming off of a miss at Worlds last year. This guy did not even make the World Championships, and it was not due to him. It was definitely due to the rest of the team. Now, if you followed the channel, or maybe if you're tuning back into the channel for Worlds, I know a lot of people do that as well, and maybe they followed in previous years or just, you know, want a lowdown of what's going on going into Worlds from somebody who's watched all the games. You'll know I've actually been a bit lower on Bdd in terms of my LCK analysis over the past couple of years because, you know, I've kind of said, like, okay, he's basically been what Showmaker has been for D plus Kia, which is a really good player that is kind of stuck on a bad team. Bdd doesn't necessarily have the same hands, but he has a way better brain than someone like Showmaker does, and so it just ends up creating, you know, a pretty even split. He's like the 4th or 5th best mid laner in the LCK, the best region for mid laners in the world. Top 3 were always going to be Chovy, Zeka, and Faker, and then, you know, Showmaker and Bdd were kind of in their own category. That has all been blown out the water. I think this is the best year of Bdd's career. I think he has completely dominated everything, and I think this is such a perfect meta for him, because really, at the end of the day, what Bdd wants to do is play these shove and roamers. He wants to play the map. He wants to be a team player because he's so good at shoving and roaming and also keeping up in CS. It's very Chovy-esque the way that he ends up doing that, because he's able to dominate lane to the point where he is allowed to roam and not lose resources for it. The thing about Bdd that makes him so exceptional in that regard is just that it does not matter who he's going into. He's going to play aggressive, and he's going to be able to move around no matter what. He's this macro impact that other teams just don't have an answer for, because he's basically unmarked in every single fight that he ends up taking. His pathing is super creative, his timers are incredibly effective, and his hands are ridiculously good. They've even gotten better over the course of this year. He's just exceptionally good, and I can't stress this enough. He's the only player from KT Rolster that received any conversation for me about getting on this list. There might be some people that think that Cuz should be somewhere around this list. I didn't see it, especially for the beginning part of the year. I think he's played much better ever since Peter came in to replace Wei, but like, Bdd is KT Rolster, and he is the single reason that this team is anywhere close to the World Championships. This reminds me of when I put Scout at 5 in 2023, when he was the back-to-back MVP for LNG. It really felt like he was the core of that team, and he ended up making top 5 at that, at least in my top 20 players at that tournament. I think Bdd is in a similar spot right now. This is an MVP caliber player that just doesn't necessarily have the rest of the team to expect that the team performance will be there at Worlds, but it shouldn't take away from what he's done across this year. He's been one of the most fun players in the world to watch, and he's more than earned this spot in the top 5 for me. Then moving on to number 4 in these rankings, and this was a player I honestly tried to justify putting a bit higher in these rankings, if you can believe it, but coming in at number 4 for me, it will be Ruler, the AD carry for Gen G, coming back to the LCK, coming back to the organization that he had found so much success on after missing Worlds last year with Kanavi on JD Gaming, and both of them really reasserting themselves, but Ruler getting himself back into the top 5, and getting himself kind of crowned as the best AD carry in the world, at least for me right now. He is the top AD carry on this list, not that that should surprise anybody if you've watched my content. I honestly think Ruler has been undersold throughout basically all of this year. It's kind of ridiculous how good this guy has been. Everybody talked about him going into MSI like he wasn't in form, like he wasn't playing well, and like, I guess if you're comparing him to like, you know, the best version of himself, that might be the case, where it's like he wasn't necessarily performing like the best AD carry of all time, but he was arguably the best AD carry in the LCK throughout a majority of spring, and certainly was a part of why Gen G was finding so much success. And then he goes to MSI and has a phenomenal tournament, is arguably the best or the second best player at that tournament, only behind Chovy, and yet still people are like, oh, is he going to be able to return to the LCK and do it? Yes, he's been good all year long. I don't really get this idea that Ruler has not been exceptional for this team. He was in the running for MVP for me if you just talked about the summer split, and I think he deserves all the praise that he's getting. Again, I think there is an argument that he should be even higher on this list, perhaps number 3, if you really want to go that route, because I think he's been so versatile in the way that he plays the game, but he's so consistent. The only reason I end up putting him a bit lower is, again, his job is so much easier than anybody else's in the top 3, really, than number 3 on this list, that he ends up getting bumped down a little bit. Top 2 were always going to be a lock for top 2 for me going into this tournament, but Ruler is just awesome, man. Like, this guy can play, you know, utility AD carries. He can play the Jhin at a really high level. He's played it a ton over the course of this year. He can play those jack-of-all-trades type of AD carries that, you know, everybody's really going for right now. Your Corkis, your Sivers, your Zayas, like champions like that, or he can just be your hyper carry, the Kaisas, the Zeris, the Jinxes. He can do whatever you need him to do. You guys know I've been saying since 2022 that he's the greatest AD carry of all time, and I think he's only really cementing that right now. He's picked up a couple more trophies for the resume here in the LCK. His bounce back has been incredible. His mechanics are elite. His decision making has been solid throughout this year. It's never going to be elite. It's always been a bit of a problem with Ruler. Not a problem, but it's always been like the one thing you can take advantage of is him maybe overstepping or not respecting where damage can come from, catching a mid-wave, obviously very importantly for Ruler, but generally speaking, this guy is almost always going to do the right thing at the right time. The question now, can he be the one to elevate Gen G more than they have been elevated in the past couple of years, because he has experience winning a world championship with this organization? Can he get a second? But that's going to bring us to number 3 on the list and my top 3, and this was pretty easy to break down. Again, top 4 was kind of my big cutoff. I wanted to get BDD in there at number 5, but coming in at number 3 for me, just outside the top 2, it's Keria, the support for T1, jumping up 17 spots. He was number 20 on the list last year coming in, and people really criticized that. People were like, he should not be on the list at all. He was not playing well in the regular season. Of course, he had a great World Championships. We knew he was going to be better at Worlds, and I thought he played better in the LCK than he was getting credit for, but all of that is thrown out the window now, because I think Keria, you know, let's isolate something. Let's give a quick thought experiment here. If you are just taking the league split from the LCK qualifiers, like the MSI qualifiers in the LCK onwards, like then up until now, Keria has just as good of a case as anyone in the entire world for number 1 on this list. He really has been that good over the second half of the year. He has been the best version of himself, arguably the best he's ever played. I think that bot lane has been electric, but this guy is a true unstoppable playmaker when he gets to play on the map. I really do think that there are just very few players in the world that can do what Keria does when he gets to feel comfortable. Gumayusi being back into form certainly helps, but one of the things about last year that made it so interesting is that Guma was hard carrying that team for a lot of the regular season, despite Keria not being very good in lane. Now, not only is Keria doing really well playing a lot of these aggressive 2v2 lane matchups, but his playmaking, his roaming, his ability to play the mid game, it's better than anybody in the world right now. The Bard, the Nico, the Rakan, these playmakers that I always talk about being in meta right now, there is nobody that is making the plays that Keria is making on the map. I really do think he opens everything up for T1. And I don't think that they would be one of the best teams in the world without him. I really do think he is that kind of difference maker. He was, borderline my MVP pick for the LCK. The only reason he didn't get it is because the official format is that spring and summer are combined. They're together. And so you get one MVP across both of them. And I think he did have some struggles in the spring regular season. We talked about Guma's struggles. Keria was right along with him. That bot lane was not very good throughout a lot of the beginning of the spring split in the regular season. But again, that series against KT Rolster, that playoff run that got them to MSI, that series against Hanwha Life, then onwards, he has been the best support in the world by a country mile, like truly outclassing everybody in terms of the playmaking he's able to do. He's even picked up things like the Poppy really consistently and made life a living hell. I think Poppy support is incredibly broken, and most players just don't know how to pilot it properly. Keria is just one of those players that, again, if he can play like he has throughout the last 3 or 4 months of this year, like he has a strong case for being #1 on this entire list. He just wasn't capable of doing it for all 10 months at the beginning of this year. I just feel really confident that this guy is going to perform like an absolute maniac right now. And again, if anybody's deserved a top 3 spot with their summer performance, I think Keria is the player who has bumped up his stock the most over the past 3 or 4 months. But that brings us to number 2 in my top 20 players, and unfortunately for the crowd out there that did not like my top 2 last year, it's the exact same as it was last year, so you're not going to like it this year as well. Coming in at number 2 for me, it is Knight, the mid laner for Billy Gaming. This is really the only place he could ever fall on this list. He's just so freaking good at League of Legends, and there are times where he's inconsistent. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like he's only played good games. There were stretches, even during the finals, especially during the finals, and that was really the big one where I was like, hey man, you got to wake up. You got to figure out what's going on. Game 1, Game 2, even Game 3 of those finals against Top Esports, I was really getting a little bit worried that Knight just wasn't going to be able to step up, but leave it to Knight to figure it out by the end of that series. He plays phenomenal in those closeout games and ends up being the player to really elevate Billy to being champions once again in the LPL. This guy has unquestionably become the best LPL player of all time. I don't think there's really any argument for it anymore. I know there are people that will argue it in my comment section, but to me, in my opinion, I mean, this guy has won the most of anybody in the history of the region. He was in Game 5 of the World Finals and, has won an international tournament, has won MSI. He really is the guy, right? He is Mr. LPL at this point, and if the LPL wants any chance of being able to win the World Championships, it's almost certainly going to have to be through Knight. He was my MVP pick for summer regular season as well. It wasn't just a playoff thing. This guy has been unbelievable throughout all of this year. I know a lot of my colleagues on LPL English not only voted for him for summer regular season MVP, but also for spring regular season MVP. This guy has just been running things throughout basically all of 2025, and I'm glad that people seem to finally be waking up about Knight in terms of just how good he actually is. It felt like for a long time people were trying to discredit Knight's performances because they never really came out internationally in the same way that they were kind of doing that for Chovy, except it was easier to do it with Knight because the LCK was a little bit more public in terms of just how the domestic success was going. Chovy winning the LCK every year was just too hard to ignore, but Knight at this point has become too difficult to ignore. This guy is bare minimum a top 3 player in the world. Look, if you want to say that Keria was better than him in the last 4 months, I kind of understand where you're coming from there, but the track record of Knight is simply too good. I think he plays a more valuable position right now in the mid lane, and I do think he is more mechanically talented than basically anybody not named Chovy in the entire world. So for me, Knight as this number 2 ranking, this is the bare minimum of where I feel comfortable placing him. Talking a bit about playstyle, whatever you want, man. If you want this guy to carry, he's basically undefeated on RE throughout his entire career. The Aurora was his most played champion throughout this year. He's very comfortable being somebody whose primary goal is to go out there and win games for his team, but if he needs to be set up on Talia or Annie, of course, he's excellent on that as well as a shove and roam player. You don't get to be one of the best players in the world this consistently without being a jack of all trades, master of all type of player. Knight is not the player you can pigeonhole or take out of a series by banning out certain types of champions or anything like that. He's incredibly versatile, he's very mechanically talented, he's smart as a player, and he's a great team fighter. The only real concern is that I just don't know if his team is going to have the success at this tournament that maybe you need in order to justify a top 2 placement. But from an individual player perspective, this isn't a primer, this isn't me ranking, what I'm expecting from him, results-wise. I think he's the second best player in the world, and he's getting ranked as such. And then there was only one player remaining here in this over hour long video. Again, if you've stuck with this the entire time, thank you so much. But number one, you know who it is. I mean, this was never going to be up for debate. It's Chovy. He's number one. He's the best player in the world. There is no argument right now, in my opinion. I think, of course, players like Knight and Keria have been excellent over the back end of the year, but it's freaking Chovy, man. This guy has just gotten everything done across this year. Okay, we can kind of throw out Winter, and I'm not trying to say that Chovy was bad in Winter. Chovy was honestly fine in Winter, especially going back and rewatching some of those games as I do going into Worlds time. I just kind of want to get an idea of where players land. He was fine in those games, maybe not the player that we would expect, but starting from spring onwards, there's just not been a conversation. This guy goes undefeated. He doesn't lose a single best of the entirety of the spring split, only loses one throughout basically the entirety of the regular season in summer, which is to T1, which is obviously, you know, it is what it is. It's a best of three, and T1's great. So they're an excellent team. You know they can beat a team like Gen G, but then they go back into the playoffs. They lose to KT Roaster. The world is collapsing. Chovy has a phenomenal lower bracket run. He beats T1. He beats KT Roaster. He beats Hanwha Life. He ends up with another LCK title. He's very quickly making his way up the rankings for most LCK championships of all time. And at this point, there's just not much to say. The only thing left for him to do is to win the World Championships. And I get it. It's a concern, right? This guy has not made the finals of Worlds, let alone won a World Championship. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend like 10 months of the year are invalidated by the fact that he's not been able to win one tournament that takes place over the course of one patch. He's won every other tournament that you can possibly win. He's a multiple-time LCK winner. He is a multiple-time MSI winner. This guy has dominated every level of competition you can possibly dominate. He even went and won EWC this year. Like, there is nothing that this guy has not done except for win the World Championship. And for me, I think this is very much the year, and whether it ends up being the case or not, you know, spoiler alert, I guess, for the primer, whether this team wins Worlds or not, like, I want to make it clear, Chovy's the best player in the world, whether he wins this tournament or not, and I know that that's going to ruffle a lot of people's feathers, and maybe people are going to get frustrated by that, but I'm sorry, when you watch this guy day in and day out, like I do, the fact that I get to watch the LCK every single week, that 5 days of the week for me are, you know, luckily, you know, brought up with LCK content, you can't have another opinion when you watch this guy. He's the best roamer in the world. He is the best laner in the world. He is the best team fighter in the world. We've talked so much about other players on this list that are like, oh, they were good for this part of the year, but maybe not so much for this part of the year. Chovy is always good. Oh, this player, you know, he's really good, but he has some games every once in a while that you have to worry about. Chovy doesn't have bad games. Like, there is no flaw with him as a player. The only issue this guy has ever had is that sometimes he can get back into that mindset he had as a younger player, which he generally doesn't have, where it's like, my team's down 5k gold, I have to start carrying. Like, I have to start being the one to get all of the gold and like really push this game forward. But even then, he's almost entirely broken that habit at this point in his career. There is nothing else left to say about Chovy. Whether he wins Worlds or not, he is the best player in the world, and he is the #1 player on this list. All right, but that is going to do it for my Worlds 2025 Top 20 Players video. This is going to be controversial. You guys are going to disagree with not just one, not just two, but a lot of these, and I totally understand that. If you and I had the same list, we would be very, very strange. It would be very strange for us to get into a room together. So again, please let me know. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? What do you think is incredibly stupid? Who did I leave off the list that you would have considered? Maybe not even an honorable mention. Who is somebody that wasn't brought up in this video that you think is more than earned a top 20 bid? Who's too low, who's too high, all of that stuff. I'm so curious to know where you guys land, and you know, please feel free to leave those down in the comments section below. But we're not done with Worlds coverage just yet. Tomorrow, as this video is going live, probably, you know, hopefully less than 24 hours after this video goes up, my Worlds 2025 primer and power rankings video will be going up onto the channel. That is the big one. Obviously, top 20 is really fun to do, but we are going to be power ranking every single team, every single player within their role, talking about the play styles, the pluses, the minuses, the expectations, and generally what you can think about every single team at the tournament from somebody who's watched them play throughout the entire year. I'm so excited for that video that comes out tomorrow. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when that video goes live. Of course, like the video if you enjoyed it. It really does mean a lot to me. It helps out the channel a ton. It gets this video out to a lot more people, and of course, you know, lets me know you guys are enjoying it as well. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all